I raised my son for 35 years. 6 days after we buried his father, my son Nathan stood in my kitchen, set an envelope on the counter, and told me I had until the end of the month to, end quote, figure out my next steps, end quote. Inside the envelope was $200 in cash and a printed list of assisted living facilities, 3 of them circled in red pen. Not by me. End quote, it and oppose. S not that we don and oppose. T love you mom, end quote, he said, not quite looking at me. End quote, it and oppose. S just this house is too much for you now. And Christine and I think it and oppose. S time you had some help. End quote. I looked at the circled listings. The cheapest one was 40 minutes outside of town, the kind of place where the brochure photos always show one smiling resident surrounded by empty chairs. End quote, I see, end quote, I said. That was all. I see. Christine, my daughter-in-law, was already measuring the living room with a little laser tool she and Oppos D bought for exactly this purpose, murmuring numbers to herself. End quote. This would make a beautiful nursery, end quote, she said to Nathan, not bothering to lower her voice. End quote. Once your mother and Oppos S settled somewhere. End quote. I want you to remember that moment because everything that came after it, the lawyers, the forged papers, the courtroom, the boardroom with 60 strangers turning to stare at me, all of it started with a woman measuring my dead husband and Oppos S living room for a crib. 10 years later my grandson would ask me, over pie in that same kitchen, why I never told anyone the truth sooner. End quote, because, end quote, I told him, end quote, your father needed to believe he and Oppos D1 before I could show him he never had a chance, end quote. He didn't, and Oppos T understand that yet. Neither did I, not fully, on the night I stood alone in my kitchen holding an envelope of cash from my own son. But I would. My name is Margaret Doyle. I was 67 years old the week they decided I was finished. I had exactly one thing they didn't and Oppos T know about, and it would take every bit of my patience I and Oppos D spent a lifetime building, to let them find out on their own terms at the worst possible moment, in front of everyone who mattered. I didn't and Oppos T argue that night. I didn't and Oppos T cry where they could see it. I put the kettle on the way I always did, and I began quietly to plan. To understand what happened you have to understand who I used to be, or rather, who everyone believed I was. I grew up in Cedar Falls, a mill town that never quite grew into a city, the kind of place where everybody and Oppos S grandmother knew everybody and Oppos S business except it turned out mine. I met Walter Doyle when I was 19, working the register at his father and Oppos S hardware store on Union Street. He had grease under his fingernails and a way of explaining things, wiring, plumbing, people, that made complicated things sound simple. End quote, you and Oppos smarter than every man who and Oppos S ever walked into this store, end quote. He told me once the week before he proposed, standing in the paint aisle with sawdust on his shoulders. End quote, I figure I and Oppos D better marry you before you notice. End quote. End quote, I and Oppos V notice for weeks, end quote, I told him. End quote, I was waiting to see if you would. End quote. We married 2 years later. We had nothing but a rented apartment above the store and a 5-year plan Walter had scrawled on the back of a receipt. Everyone in town remembers the Doyle says, end quote, the hardware people, end quote, that part is true. What they don and Oppos T know is what happened after 1988, when Walter and I quietly bought out 3 failing regional suppliers during a recession nobody else wanted to touch, merged them under one name, and built what would eventually become Doyle Industrial Supply. A company that, by the time Walter passed, operated in 11 states and employed almost 4,000 people. We never talked about it at church potlucks. We never talked about it, period, if we could help it. End quote. Money changes how people look at you, end quote. Walter used to say, end quote, and I like the way they look at you now. End quote. So when the company went public in the late 90s we didn't and Oppos T sell our shares, we moved them into something called the W and AMP Family Trust, structured so that our name never had to appear on a single press release. Professional managers ran the company. We stayed home. I kept gardening. Walter kept fixing things that didn't and Oppos T need fixing because he liked fixing things. There was a season in the early years when I nearly convinced Walter to tell people the truth. It was 1994, and Nathan had just started 3rd grade. And a boy in his class had made fun of his second-hand sneakers at recess. He came home crying, and I remember standing in the kitchen wanting more than anything to march down to that school and remind everyone exactly whose family they were dealing with. End quote. We could buy him whatever shoes he wants, end quote. I told Walter that night. End quote. We could buy the whole shoe store if it came to that. Why are we letting our son come home crying over sneakers when we don and oppose? Have to? End quote. Walter was quiet for a long time, turning a coffee mug in his hands. End quote. Because someday, end quote, he finally said, end quote, he and oppose going to need to know the difference between people who like him and people who like what he has. And he and oppose never going to learn that if we hand him a life where nobody and oppose ever tested which one they are, end quote. I didn't and oppose agree with him that night. I bought Nathan a new pair of sneakers anyway, ordinary ones, the same brand every other boy in his class wore, and told him nothing about why he couldn't and oppose have had nicer ones years earlier if we and oppose wanted. It took me another decade to understand that Walter hadn't and oppose been talking only about shoes. We raised Nathan in the same 3-bedroom house I still live in today, the one with the crooked porch step Walter never got around to replacing. Nathan never went without good schools, a used car at 16 that we made him earn half of, a modest college fund. But he never once flew first class or wore a name brand jacket, because Walter and I had made a decision early on, one I never regretted, not even on the worst nights of what came later. End quote. We and oppose not raising an heir, end quote. Walter told me the year Nathan was born. End quote. We and oppose raising a person. End quote. End quote. And if he never forgives us for it? End quote, I asked. I remember the exact chair I was sitting in, the exact color of the evening outside the window. Walter thought about that longer than I expected him to. End quote. Then he and oppose I'll be angry at two people who loved him enough to risk it, end quote. He finally said. End quote. That and oppose better than being loved by two people who were too afraid to try. End quote. I believed that was the right choice for 29 years. Then Walter died of a heart attack in the garden shed on a Tuesday in March, and within a week, I discovered exactly what kind of person we had raised. The funeral was tasteful. Walter would have hated the flowers, too many lilies. He always said they smelled like a dentist and oppo's office, but he would have loved how many people came. Half the town, it seemed. Men he and oppos sold lumber to 50 years ago. Women I and oppos taught Sunday school with. Old Doyle Industrial Supply retirees who drove 2 hours because, end quote, Walter Doyle gave me my first real job. End quote. Nathan gave the eulogy. He talked about fishing trips, about his father teaching him to change a tire, about a man who, end quote, never wanted more than what he had. End quote. It was a good speech. I cried through most of it. I didn't and oppos notice at the time that Christine spent the reception walking through my house with her phone out, taking photos of rooms. End quote. For insurance, end quote, she told me when I finally asked. End quote. In case anything happens to the house. You should really get a full appraisal done, Margaret. Older homes like this, you never know what they and oppos worth. End quote. I should have understood what that meant. I didn't and oppos not yet. Grief has a way of making you slow to suspicion, even when suspicion is exactly what the moment requires. It was 6 days later that Nathan set the envelope on my counter. End quote. $200, end quote. I said, counting it in front of him, not because I needed to, but because I wanted him to watch me count it. End quote. That and oppos what you think I and oppos am worth, Nathan? End quote. End quote. That and oppos not what this is about. End quote. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit from childhood, the same gesture he made when he was 7 and had broken a window with a baseball. End quote. It and oppos about being practical. You and oppos 67. Dad handled everything, the bills, the taxes, all of it. You don and oppos even know how much is in the checking account, do you? End quote. I did know. I knew to the dollar. I had known for 40 years because I had reviewed every account, every filing, every trust statement personally, in a small locked office behind the pantry that Nathan had walked past 10,000 times in his life and never once asked about. But I said nothing. End quote. We just think, end quote. Christine added, sliding onto the stool at my kitchen island like she owned it, end quote. That it would be so much easier for everyone if we simplified things. Sell the house, end quote. End quote. This is a real house, end quote, I said quietly. End quote. You know what I mean. End quote. End quote. I think what Christine and Appos is trying to say, end quote. Nathan added, softer now, the way he used to soften his voice right before asking for money as a teenager, end quote, is that none of us want to see you rattling around this big old house by yourself, falling on the stairs, forgetting to turn off the stove. It happens, Mom. It happens to people who swore it never would. End quote. End quote. I haven't and Appos. T forgotten to turn off a stove in 50 years, Nathan. End quote. End quote. Yet, end quote. Christine said and smiled when she said it, as though the word were a kindness. I did know what she meant. She meant my house. She meant my life, packaged and sold and repurposed for her nursery. That night after they left, I sat alone at Walter and Appos' old desk, the one with the crooked drawer, and I opened it for the first time since the funeral. Inside was a business card I hadn't in Appos' looked at in 15 years. Arthur Kessler, SQ, Kessler and Amp. Vance Attorneys at Law. I picked up the phone. End quote, Mr. Kessler, end quote, I said when he answered, end quote. It and Appos' Margaret Doyle. I think it and Appos' time we talked about the trust. End quote. There was a pause on the line, and then in the careful voice of a man who had been waiting a long time for this call, he said, end quote, I was wondering when you and Appos' call Margaret. I heard about Walter. I and Appos am so sorry. Come in Thursday. Bring nothing but yourself. End quote. I hung up the phone and for the first time since the funeral I smiled. I want to be clear about something. I did not go to Arthur Kessler and Appos' office plotting revenge. I went because a widow with any sense checks on her affairs after her husband dies, and because some instinct, the same instinct that had once told me not to trust a supplier who smiled too much, told me that my son and Appos' sudden concern for my end quote, practical end quote, future had very little to do with me. Over the following weeks, Nathan and Christine did not let up. If anything, they grew bolder, the way people do when the first attempt at something goes unpunished. Christine began end quote, helping end quote, with my mail, which meant intercepting bank statements before I saw them. Nathan started dropping by unannounced with a folder of listings for end quote, senior living communities end quote, each one a little further from town than the last. At Sunday dinner, which they now insisted on hosting at my house, strangely, given how eager they were to sell it, Christine mentioned almost casually that a real estate agent friend of hers had said the market was end quote, hot right now end quote, and it would be a shame to end quote, miss the window end quote. End quote, what window? End quote, I asked. End quote, for selling. While interest rates are good. End quote. End quote, I and Appos am not selling my house, Christine. End quote. She smiled the particular smile of a woman who has already decided the conversation is over, and is simply waiting for you to catch up. End quote, of course not. Not if you Don and Appos want to. End quote. I noticed things after that. A missing spare key from the hook by the door. A stranger in Appos' car idling outside my house for 20 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. A man inside taking photographs with his phone, the kind of photographs an appraiser takes. My checkbook, which I kept in the drawer of my nightstand, moved 3 inches to the left. A small thing, the kind of thing only a woman who has lived in one house for 42 years would notice. I did not confront them. I did not call the police over a checkbook that had merely moved. I did not cry or shout or demand answers. I watched. I remembered. I wrote things down in a small notebook I began keeping in my apron pocket. Dates, times, exact words. Walter used to say that in business, the person who keeps the better records wins the argument 9 times out of 10, even when they and Appos wrong. I intended to be the person keeping the better records. On Thursday, I drove myself to Arthur Kessler and Appos' office downtown, a narrow brick building I hadn't and Appos' stepped foot in for over a decade, and sat across from a man who had aged into someone and Appos' kind grandfather since I and Appos' last seen him, though his eyes were as sharp as ever. End quote, Margaret end quote, he said, folding his hands on the desk. End quote, the trust is intact. Walter structured it beautifully, better than most attorneys twice his experience could have managed. You and Appos The sole trustee now as of his passing. 62% of Doyle Industrial Supply, held entirely under the W&M Family Trust. Nobody outside this office and 2 members of the DS board knows your name is attached to that trust. Not even, end quote. End quote. Not even Nathan, end quote, I finished. End quote, I know. End quote. Arthur studied me for a long moment. End quote. May I ask why you never told him? End quote. I thought about the envelope with $200 in it. I thought about Christine and Appo's laser measuring tool against my living room wall. End quote, I think, end quote, I said slowly, end quote, I and Appo's am about to find out if that was the right decision. End quote. Arthur slid a folder across the desk, thick tab, the kind of document that takes a team of paralegals weeks to assemble. End quote. Here and Appo's your position in plain terms, end quote, he said. End quote. Doyle Industrial Supply had revenue last year of just under $400 million. As trustee, you control the majority voting shares. The board answers to the trust, meaning functionally the board answers to you whether they and Appo's ever laid eyes on you or not. You have final say on the CEO and Appo's contract renewal, which happens to come up for a vote in 8 months. End quote. I turned a page. Numbers I understood better than most people understood their own names. I had, after all, watched every one of them accumulate for 30 years, quietly from behind a pantry door. End quote. There and Appo's something else, end quote. Arthur said more carefully now. End quote. Your son works there. End quote. I looked up. End quote. I know Nathan has a job in logistics somewhere in the Midwest region. He and Appo's never told me the company name. I assumed it was one of a dozen distributors. End quote. End quote. It and Appo's end quote, Arthur said. End quote. Regional Operations Manager, Midwest Division. Been there 6 years. Solid reviews from what I understand, though there and Appo's been some noise lately. A formal complaint filed against him last quarter for falsifying a shipment report to cover a missed delivery deadline. Nothing that in Appo's cost him his job yet. But it and Appo's the kind of thing that tends to resurface. End quote. I sat with that for a long moment. My son, who thought his mother didn't and Appo's understand how the end quote, real world end quote, worked, who thought I needed to be moved into a facility for people who could no longer manage their own affairs, had spent 6 years building a career inside a company he had no idea his own mother controlled. End quote. Does he know the name of the trust? End quote. I asked. End quote. No reason he would. It and Appo's never been public. To him, des just belongs to and Appo's, the shareholders and Appo's, some faceless entity, same as it is to 99% of the employees. End quote. I closed the folder. End quote. Arthur, end quote, I said, end quote, I and Appo's like to do 3 things. First, I want a full independent competency evaluation on my own file, dated and notarized, effective immediately, before anyone can claim otherwise. Second, I want you to quietly find out who and Appo's been circling my house with a camera. And third, end quote, I paused. End quote. I want to know everything there is to know about my son and Appo's job performance. Everything. I have a feeling I and Appo's am going to need it. End quote. Arthur wrote for a moment, then looked up, something like admiration in his expression. End quote. Margaret, if you Don and Appo's mind my asking what changed? You and Appo's held this trust quietly for 30 years. Why act now? End quote. I thought about the folded list of assisted living facilities, 3 of them circled in red. End quote. My son gave me $200 and a moving deadline 6 days after we buried his father. End quote, I said. End quote. I think it and Appo's time he understood exactly who he was trying to move. End quote. If I had hoped that quietly gathering information would slow things down, I was wrong. If anything, my silence seemed to embolden them further, as though my calm was proof I had nothing left to fight with. 3 weeks after my meeting with Arthur, Nathan showed up at my door on a Saturday morning holding a manila folder of his own. End quote. I talked to an elder law attorney, end quote. He said, sliding the folder across my kitchen table without asking to sit. End quote. Just to understand our options. Since Dad handled everything and you and Appo's Well, you and Oppos. Not used to managing finances alone. End quote. You have an attorney. End quote. End quote. Every woman my age should. End quote. I said and smiled the way Christine liked to smile. The smile that ends a conversation before the other person realizes it. And Oppos. Over. He left angrier than he and Oppos arrived. 3 days after that, I finally caught the man with the camera. I and Oppos seen the gray sedan parked across the street twice that week, always for exactly as long as it took to lose interest and drive off. And on a Thursday afternoon I decided I was done pretending I hadn't. And Oppos noticed. I walked out my front door, down the porch steps, straight across the street, and knocked on the driver and Oppos' side window before he had time to start the engine. He rolled it down halfway, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a lanyard tucked under his collar, the kind of face built for being unremarkable. End quote. Ma and Oppos. Am I Don and Oppos think. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos. Am going to ask you a question. End quote. I said. End quote. And I and Oppos. Like you to consider very carefully whether lying to a woman standing 3 feet from your car is worth whatever they and Oppos repaying you. Who hired you? End quote. He hesitated long enough that I already had my answer. End quote. I and Oppos am not at liberty to discuss my clients. End quote. End quote. Then I and Oppos, I'll discuss it for you. End quote. I said. End quote. You and Oppos. Been parked outside this house 4 times in the last 2 weeks, always with a camera pointed at my front door and my driveway. That and Oppos' not real estate work. That and Oppos' surveillance. And surveillance of a private citizen who hasn't. And Oppos' consented to it sits a good deal closer to a crime than whoever hired you is telling you it does. End quote. Something in his face shifted. Not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man being reminded that his job has a name uglier than the one on his invoice. End quote. Ma and Oppos. Am I just take the photographs. End quote. He said. End quote. I Don and Oppos. Ask what they and Oppos for. End quote. End quote. Then I and Oppos start asking. End quote. I told him. End quote. Before you find your name attached to something you didn't and Oppos sign up for. End quote. I didn't and Oppos get his name that day. I didn't and Oppos need to. Ruiz, once Arthur brought him in weeks later, found it within an afternoon. Invoices Don and Oppos lie the way people do, but I and Oppos always believed that conversation on the street mattered more than the paperwork that came after it. It was the first time in this entire ordeal that I stopped absorbing what was being done to me, and started making the people doing it uncomfortable instead. 2 days later, my neighbor Ruth called to tell me gently that Christine had stopped by. End quote, checking in. End quote, while I was at the grocery store and had let herself in through the unlocked side door to. End quote, drop off soup. End quote. Ruth had watched from her porch as Christine spent nearly 20 minutes inside my house alone. When I got home, my jewelry box, nothing valuable in it, just Walter and Oppos' mother and Oppos' pearl earrings and a wedding band that no longer fit, had been opened and rifled through. Nothing was missing. It wasn't an Oppos' about the jewelry. It was reconnaissance. That Sunday at dinner, Nathan brought it up again. This time with an edge in his voice I hadn't and Oppos' heard since he was a teenager, arguing about curfew. End quote. You didn't and Oppos' signed the POA. End quote. He said. End quote. No. End quote. End quote. Mom, I Don and Oppos' understand why you and Oppos' fighting me on this. I and Oppos am trying to protect you. End quote. End quote. From what, Nathan? End quote. He hesitated, just long enough that I understood the truth of it before he even said the words. End quote. From yourself. People your age, sometimes they Don and Oppos realize when they and Oppos being taken advantage of. When they and Oppos not thinking clearly. I and Oppos read stories, Mom. Elderly widows, alone, no one watching out for them, and some stranger convinces them to sign over everything. End quote. He said. End quote, stranger. End quote, and looked, just for a fraction of a second, toward the hallway that led to Walter and Oppos' old office. Toward the drawer where I now kept Arthur and Oppos' card. He knew. Or he suspected. Someone, the man with the camera most likely, hired by Christine and Oppos' real estate friend, or worse, by someone else entirely, had seen me leaving Kessler and Amp, Vance and reported back. End quote. I and Oppos am thinking more clearly than I have in years. End quote. I told him, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I let a little of my real voice through. End quote. Careful, Nathan. You and Oppos. About to say something you can and Oppos. Take back. End quote. He didn't and Oppos apologize. He gathered his coat and at the door without turning around he said, end quote, if you Don and Oppos, sign it voluntarily mom there are other ways to handle this, end quote. The door closed. I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time. Other ways I thought. Let and Oppos, see what those are. I found out what end quote. Other ways end quote, meant within the week and it had nothing to do with paperwork. Ruth had cleaned my house every other Tuesday for 11 years, ever since her husband and Oppos' construction business went under and she and Oppos' needed the extra income more than she and Oppos' wanted to admit to anyone at church. It was an Oppos' charity. I paid her fairly and she worked hard for it, but it had become something more than a transaction over the years. She was the closest thing I had to a sister. She called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice unsteady in a way I and Oppos' never heard before. End quote. Margaret, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not be angry with me. End quote. End quote. Ruth, what happened? End quote. End quote. Your son came by my house last night. Alone. Sat in my kitchen and told me that with your situation being what it is, families sometimes need to look real close at who and Oppos' been in and out of the house. Said something about how insurance companies ask questions when there and Oppos' ever any missing property and how it and Oppos' be a shame if anyone thought I and Oppos' taken advantage of a confused old woman. End quote. She let out a breath. End quote. Margaret, he as good as told me if I Don and Oppos' stop being your friend he and Oppos' I'll make sure nobody in this town hires me again. End quote. I sat very still, gripping the phone hard enough that my knuckles ached. End quote. He threatened your livelihood. End quote. End quote. He didn't and Oppos' say it like a threat. He said it real friendly like he was doing me a favor by warning me. But I and Oppos' cleaned houses in this town for 30 years, Margaret. I know exactly what a warning sounds like when a man and Oppos' trying to be polite about it. End quote. I closed my eyes. Nathan had learned somewhere in the last several weeks that isolating me might work faster than confronting me directly, and he and Oppos' started with the person he assumed had the least power to fight back. End quote. Ruth, I want you to keep coming on Tuesdays. I and Oppos' I'll pay you the same, and if anyone in this town so much as looks at you sideways because of my son, you call me immediately, and I promise you it will be handled. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos' am not scared of losing customers, Margaret. End quote. Ruth said, and her voice steadied for the first time in the call. End quote. I and Oppos' am scared of what kind of man threatens a 60-year-old widow and Oppos' income to get to his own mother. End quote. I didn't and Oppos' tell Ruth that day exactly what kind of man that was, or what he stood to inherit without ever knowing it. I only told Arthur the next morning, adding one more line item to the growing file he kept locked in a drawer at his office, a file that was quickly becoming less a defense and more an inventory of everything my son was willing to destroy on his way toward a house he mistakenly believed was the whole prize. It wasn't an Oppos' only Ruth. 2 weeks later Mia called me in tears. Not yet the confidant she would become, still at that point, someone caught entirely between two people she loved. End quote. Dad said if I keep visiting you so much it and Oppos' going to and Oppos' complicate things legally and Oppos' end quote, she told me. End quote. He said if this ends up in court, a judge might ask why his own granddaughter is spending so much time with someone who supposedly can and Oppos' take care of herself and that it would look better for everyone, better for you, he said, if I kept my distance until things were settled. End quote. End quote. And what did you say? End quote. End quote. I said okay. End quote. She admitted ashamed. End quote. Grandma, I didn't and Oppos' want to make things worse for you. I thought I was helping. End quote. I understood in that moment something about the way cruelty works inside a family that I Don and Oppos' think I and Oppos' ever fully understood before, even watching it unfold around me for weeks. It rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives dressed as caution, as practicality, as love with conditions attached, and by the time you recognize it for end quote. He was right. I found out about the guardianship filing not from Nathan, but from Ruth, who and Oppose. Dee heard it from her cousin who worked at the county courthouse. End quote. Margaret end quote. Ruth said, her voice shaking through the phone end quote. I Don and Oppose. T want to alarm you, but I think you should know, someone and Oppose s filed papers. A petition for guardianship. It names you. End quote. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the same one where Nathan had slid his POA form 3 weeks earlier. End quote. Do you know who filed it? End quote. End quote. Cousin didn't and Oppose T say a name. Just said it and Oppose s a family matter filed this week. End quote. I already knew who it was. I called Arthur immediately. He was quiet on the other end for a moment, and then in the calm, unhurried voice of a man who had clearly expected this eventually, he said, end quote, I and Oppose, I'll pull the filing this afternoon. Margaret, I need you to understand something. A guardianship petition, if granted, doesn't and Oppose T just affect your day-to-day life. It can suspend your authority as trustee. If a judge finds you incompetent, someone else, potentially the very person who filed this petition, could be granted authority over the trust itself. End quote. My stomach turned cold. End quote. Over the company. End quote. End quote. Over everything. End quote, Arthur said. End quote. This isn't an Oppose T about a house anymore, Margaret. Whoever filed this either knows exactly what and Oppose s at stake, or they and Oppose about to find out the hard way. End quote. The petition, when Arthur obtained a copy, named Nathan as the proposed guardian. The grounds cited end quote, increasing confusion end quote, vulnerability to undue influence by unknown third parties end quote, a clear reference to my visits with Arthur, and most galling of all, a claim that I had end quote, recently exhibited erratic financial behavior inconsistent with prior patterns end quote. Attached as an exhibit was a photocopy of a check I had written to Arthur and Oppose s firm for legal fees. The very lawyer I had hired to protect myself had been used as evidence that I couldn't and Oppose T be trusted to manage my own affairs. I sat with the paper spread across my kitchen table and felt, for the first time in this entire ordeal, something closer to fear than anger. Not fear of losing the house or the money. Fear of what it would mean if a judge, a stranger who had never met me, who would see only what was presented to him in a folder, decided that my own son knew me better than I knew myself. End quote. There and Oppose s something else end quote, Arthur said, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. End quote. The petition includes a supporting affidavit. From your granddaughter. End quote. My chest tightened. End quote, Mia? End quote. End quote, Mia Doyle. 24 years old. The affidavit states she and Oppose s and Oppose observed concerning changes and Oppose in your behavior and supports her father and Oppose s petition. End quote. I closed my eyes. Mia, who used to fall asleep on my porch swing with her head on my shoulder, who called me every Sunday from her dorm room just to talk about nothing, who I had genuinely believed loved me without complication, had signed something to help take away my life. For the first time since the funeral, I let myself cry. Not for the trust, not for the company, not even for the house. For the granddaughter I thought I knew. I did something I hadn't an Oppose T done in months. I called Mia directly. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was bright, easy, entirely unaware of what I now knew. End quote, Grandma. Hey, I and Oppose we been meaning to call. End quote. End quote. Mia. End quote. I said, and something in my tone must have carried because she went quiet. End quote. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you sign an affidavit for your father and Oppose s guardianship petition? End quote. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. End quote. Grandma, it wasn't an Oppose T what you think. Dad said it was just a formality, something about insurance for your care. He showed me this form and said if I loved you I and Oppose D sign it to help protect you, and I didn't and Oppose T even read the whole. End quote. She stopped. End quote. Oh my God. Grandma, what did I sign? End quote. End quote. You signed a statement supporting a legal petition to have me declared incompetent. End quote. I said as gently as I could manage. End quote. To take control of my finances. My home. Everything, end quote. End quote. I would never, Grandma, I swear to you I didn't and oppose Tino. He told me you and oppose. D been forgetting things that you called him confused about bills that, end quote. End quote. None of that happened, Mia. End quote. Another long silence. When she spoke again her voice had changed entirely. Hardened the way a young person and oppose. S voice hardens the first time they understand an adult they trusted has lied to them. End quote. I have an internship, end quote, she said slowly, end quote, this semester. At S corporate. Compliance department. End quote, a pause. End quote, Grandma, is that a coincidence? Doyle Industrial Supply. End quote. I closed my eyes. I had not planned to tell her this way over the phone, in the middle of a crisis her own father had created. But some truths choose their own moment. End quote, no, end quote, I said. End quote, it and oppose, it's not a coincidence. Mia, I need you to come here. Tonight if you can. There are things about this family about me, that I should have told you and your father a long time ago. I think I was wrong to wait. End quote. She came within the hour, and I told her everything. The store on Union Street. The recession buyout. The trust. 62%. Her grandfather and oppose, S decision made with love to raise a son who didn't and oppose. T know what he had so he might grow into someone who didn't and oppose. T need it. Mia sat across from me at the kitchen table for a long time after I finished, turning a mug of tea in her hands without drinking it. End quote. He works there, end quote, she finally said. End quote, Dad. He and oppose. S been trying to get promoted to regional director for 2 years. He talks about the shareholders like they and oppose. Some faceless committee that doesn't and oppose. T care about people like him. End quote, she looked up at me. End quote, Grandma, does he know? End quote. End quote, no, end quote, I said. End quote, and I need him not to know. Not yet. End quote. End quote, why? End quote. I thought of the envelope with $200 in it. I thought of the guardianship petition sitting on Arthur and Oppo's desk, built partly on the strength of her own trusting borrowed signature. End quote, because your father needs to walk all the way into the trap he and Oppo's building for me, end quote, I said, end quote, before he understands it was never mine to walk into, end quote. Mia was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. End quote. Tell me what you need me to do. End quote. I hesitated before answering, because what I was about to ask of her was not small. End quote. For now nothing, end quote, I said. End quote. Keep going to your internship. Keep being exactly the diligent, careful person you already are. If you happen to notice anything unusual in the compliance files, anything at all, you don and oppose. T go looking for it and you don and oppose. T take anything you and oppose. Re not supposed to have. But if it crosses your desk in the ordinary course of your work, you don and oppose. T have to unsee it either. End quote. End quote. You want me to be careful, not blind, end quote. End quote. Exactly that. End quote. Mia turned her mug in her hands, the way her grandfather used to turn his coffee cup when he was thinking through a problem from every angle before committing to a decision. End quote. Grandma, can I ask you something? All these years didn't and oppose. T you ever want people to know? Didn't and oppose. T it ever feel lonely, being the only person who understood how big all of this actually was? End quote. I thought about that question longer than I expected to. End quote. There were nights, end quote, I admitted. End quote, your grandfather used to say the same thing near the end, that it might have been nice just once to walk into a room and let people see the whole of what we and oppose. D built instead of the small careful version we showed everyone. But then I and oppose, D think about children like your father, growing up already knowing exactly how much they were worth in dollars before they and oppose. D figured out how much they were worth in anything else and I and oppose. D remember why we chose what we chose, end quote. I reached across the table and took her hand. End quote, you at least got to grow up not knowing. And look at the person that made. End quote. Mia and oppose. S eyes were wet when she finally spoke again. End quote. I and oppose. Am not going to let him do this to you. End quote. End quote. You and oppose. Re not going to do anything to him either and quote, I said gently. And quote, you and Oppos. Re only going to tell the truth when the time comes about he could be terminated for cause. Possibly worse, depending on whether outside auditors get involved. And quote. I absorbed this news the way I absorbed most difficult things now, quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. There was more. Arthur and Oppos, investigator, a retired detective named Ruiz who Arthur trusted implicitly, had identified the man who and Oppos, been photographing my house. He wasn't an Oppos, a real estate appraiser at all. He was a private investigator hired not by Christine and Oppos' friend but directly by Nathan 3 weeks before the guardianship petition was even filed. Ruiz had obtained a copy of the invoice, surveillance and documentation, subject M. Doyle behavioral pattern assessment. They had been building their case against me for over a month before the $200 envelope ever hit my counter. The kindness Christine had shown at the funeral measuring rooms for a nursery, that hadn't and Oppos' been grief-clouded insensitivity. It had been the opening move. And there was one more thing. Buried in a folder Ruiz obtained through the investigator and Oppos' own carelessly stored files, an email from Christine to Nathan, sent the week after the funeral. She and Oppos' sitting on that house and who knows what else. Walter never talked about money, but you know these old hardware families, they're and Oppos' always more than people think. If we can show a pattern of confusion, even a little doesn't and Oppos' take much for a judge to sign off. We just need to move before she gets any ideas of her own. I read that email 3 times. Then I set it down on the table and folded my hands and sat very still for a long while, the way I imagine Walter used to sit when a business deal went sideways and he needed a minute before deciding what to do next. End quote, she knew end quote, I finally said to Arthur when he called to check on me. End quote. Christine knew there was more than the house. She just didn't and Oppos' know what. End quote. End quote. Do you want to use the email in court? End quote, Arthur asked. I thought about it for a long moment. End quote. Not yet end quote, I said. End quote. Let and Oppos' let them finish digging their hole first. End quote. Ruiz called me directly the following week, something Arthur had cleared in advance, on the theory that I deserved to hear certain things in a voice that wasn't and Oppos' filtered through a lawyer and Oppos' caution. End quote, Mrs. Doyle, I and Oppos' done this kind of work for going on 20 years end quote. He said end quote, and I and Oppos' I'll be honest with you, most families I investigate there and Oppos' some version of a reasonable disagreement underneath all the ugliness. Somebody and Oppos' genuinely worried, somebody and Oppos' genuinely stubborn, and it gets messy, but it and Oppos' not malicious, not really. This ISN and Oppos' that. End quote. End quote, what is it then? End quote. End quote. Your son opened a separate bank account 4 months ago. End quote, Ruiz said. End quote. Small balance, nothing dramatic, but the deposits match almost exactly to withdrawals from what looks like your late husband and Oppos' old checking account, the one you told me you stopped monitoring closely right after the funeral because your grief made you trust Nathan to help manage the mail. $200 here, $300 there. Small enough a person might not notice for months. That and Oppos' not confusion, Mrs. Doyle. That and Oppos' a plan. End quote. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, thinking of every time Christine had cheerfully volunteered to end quote, help end quote, with the mail. End quote. How much altogether? End quote. End quote. A little over $4,000 so far. End quote. It wasn't an Oppos' the number that struck me. $4,000 was nothing measured against what they were truly after. It was the smallness of it, the sheer grinding patience of taking a little at a time, the same patience I had spent my whole life practicing for entirely different reasons, being used against me instead. End quote. Keep documenting it end quote, I told Ruiz. End quote. Every dollar. End quote. End quote. Already am end quote, he said. End quote. Mrs. Doyle, if I can say something outside my job description for a second, my own mother and Oppos' 81. Sharp as anything. I hope to God my sister never does to her what your son and Oppos' doing to you. Some things a person doesn't and Oppos' get to come back from, even if the courts let them walk away clean. End quote. I thanked him and hung up the phone, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself feel something other than sorrow when I thought about what was coming for Nathan. I let myself feel certain. For the next 6 weeks I did something that went against every instinct I had. I let them believe they were winning. I stopped fighting the guardianship hearing date when Nathan and Appo's lawyer pushed it earlier. I signed nothing, but I also stopped visibly resisting. No angry phone calls, no confrontations at Sunday dinners, which had, mercifully, stopped happening altogether. I let Christine believe her real estate friend and Appo's pre-listing consultation had gone unnoticed when she brought him by the house under the guise of checking the furnace. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea while a stranger in a blazer walked through my bedroom with a clipboard, murmuring things like original hardwood, that and Appo's selling point and this wallpaper will need to go obviously and I said nothing at all, only asked if he and Appo's like a cup of tea too, which seemed to unsettle him more than anything Christine had said in months. She and Appo's taking it well I heard him whisper to Christine on his way out. She doesn't and Appo's really understand what and Appo's happening anymore Christine whispered back. It and Appo's sad honestly. She used to be sharp as a tack. I refilled my teacup and said nothing and thought, not for the first time, that being underestimated was turning out to be the most useful tool in the entire ordeal. Mia, meanwhile, kept me quietly informed of a different kind of theater unfolding at the DES regional office. Nathan apparently had begun telling colleagues he was close to a director-level promotion, dropping hints in the break room about a bigger office, a company car, a title that would finally put him in the room where decisions get made He told the whole team Friday that once the shareholder meeting wraps up next month, there and Appo's going to be some changes at the top of our division Mia told me over the phone, something halfway between amusement and heartbreak in her voice. Grandma, he doesn't and Appo's know. He genuinely, completely doesn't and Appo's know. Let him keep talking I said. A man who thinks he and Appo's about to win rarely stops to check whether the game has already been decided. There was, admittedly, a small and not entirely admirable part of me that took some satisfaction in it. In knowing that every confident word Nathan said to his co-workers about his bright future at Doyle Industrial Supply was a word spoken directly into the ear of the one person whose signature could end that future in an afternoon. I let Nathan believe his mother had grown tired, confused, resigned to whatever fate her family had decided for her. Cost me more than I expected. There were nights I sat alone in Walter and Appo's old office looking at photographs of Nathan as a boy, 6 years old on his father and Appo's shoulders at the county fair, 16 and gap-toothed with his first fixed-up car, and wondered whether the man plotting to have me declared incompetent even remembered being that boy. Arthur, meanwhile, was not idle. He filed my competency evaluation quietly, weeks before the hearing, from 3 independent physicians, all of whom found me, in the dry clinical language of medical reports, of sound mind, exceptional cognitive function for age, with no indication of impairment, He prepared but did not file a response to the guardianship petition that laid out, point by point, every falsehood in Nathan and Appo's filing. He kept Ruiz and Appo's investigation materials in a locked drawer waiting. And most importantly, at my instruction, he reached out, quietly through a third party so my name never appeared, to the chair of the Doyle Industrial Supply Board of Directors, informing them only that the trust and Appo's sole trustee intended to attend the upcoming annual shareholder meeting in person for the first time in company history, and would like the floor reserved for a statement following the standard business agenda. The board chair, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had run the company for 11 years without ever once meeting the trust and Appo's controlling shareholder, called Arthur back within the hour. After 11 years, she said, I finally get to meet the person who and Appo's owned my company the whole time? She and Appo's prefer to introduce herself, Arthur told her. In her own time. In her own way, The shareholder meeting was scheduled for the second Thursday of the following month. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for the Monday after that. I looked at the calendar Arthur had drawn, and I and Apos, D like you to make sure my son and Apos, S division director happens to be attending as well, end quote. End quote. He will be, end quote, Arthur said. End quote. Regional managers are required at the annual meeting this year. Cost-cutting review, mandatory attendance for anyone up for a leadership vote. Which, as it happens, your son is. End quote. I allowed myself for the first time in months a small satisfied smile. End quote. Good, end quote, I said. End quote. Let him come. End quote. The Grand Concourse Hotel ballroom in the city held perhaps 400 people the morning of the annual shareholder meeting. Institutional investors, board members, division heads flown in from 11 states. A scattering of financial journalists in the back row with laptops open. I wore the navy dress I and Apos, D worn to Walter and Apos' retirement dinner 15 years earlier, the only formal thing in my closet that still fit properly. Mia had offered twice to take me shopping for something newer. I and Apos, D told her no both times. Whatever I said in that room, I wanted to say it as exactly who I already was. End quote. Are you nervous? End quote. Mia asked me in the car, her knuckles pale on the steering wheel in a way that suggested she was more nervous than I was. End quote. A little, end quote, I admitted. End quote. Your grandfather used to say nerves are just your body reminding you that something matters. I and Apos, D be more worried if I felt nothing at all. End quote. End quote. What are you going to say to him when you see him? End quote. I thought about that for the length of 2 stoplights. End quote. Nothing at first, end quote, I said. End quote. I think the room is going to say it for me. End quote. Mia sat beside me in the front row. Her hand finding mine under the folded meeting program the moment the lights dimmed for the opening remarks. Nathan was seated 4 rows back with the other regional managers, close enough that I could see the back of his head, the same cowlick he and Apos, D had since he was 7, and far enough that he had no reason at all to notice the 2 women in the front row. Patricia Alvarez ran through the standard business, quarterly earnings, a new distribution center opening in Tennessee, a round of polite applause for a retiring board member. I barely heard any of it. I was watching the back of my son and Apos' head and thinking about an envelope with $200 in it. Then Patricia reached the final item on the agenda. End quote. Before we close, end quote, she said, and something in her voice made the room settle, the way a room settles when it senses something unscripted is about to happen, end quote. I and Apos, D like to depart briefly from our usual format. For 37 years, Doyle Industrial Supply has operated under the ownership structure of the W&M Family Trust, a majority stakeholder whose identity, per the trust and Apos' own long-standing wishes, has never been publicly disclosed. That trustee has asked for the floor today, for the first time in this company and Apos' history, and I think, given everything this company owes to that trust and Apos' stewardship, we should hear what she has to say, end quote. A murmur moved through the room. I felt Mia and Apos' hand tighten around mine. I stood. I did not rush to the podium. I walked the way I had walked into that hospital hallway, into Arthur and Apos' office, into every hard room of my life, steadily without apology, in a navy dress that had been unfashionable for a decade and didn't and Apos' matter in the slightest. I heard from 4 rows back the exact moment my son and Apos' chair scraped against the floor as he sat up straighter, trying to place the woman walking to the front of the room. I heard him say quietly to the manager beside him, end quote, wait, is that, end quote. I reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. End quote. My name is Margaret Doyle, end quote, I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, did not shake. End quote. My husband Walter and I founded this company from a hardware store on Union Street in Cedar Falls, 51 years ago. I have held 62% ownership of this company, through the W&M Family Trust, since his passing 10 months ago. Before that, we held it together quietly for 30 years. End quote. The room had gone completely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard a chair scrape again, slower this time, as though the person standing up wasn't Apos' entirely sure his legs would hold him. I looked up, past the 400 strangers in that ballroom, directly at my son. and quote, I and oppose, D like to explain and quote, I said and quote, why I never told anyone. And I and oppose, D like to explain what I and oppose, V learned these last few months about which members of my family deserve to know. And quote, Nathan and oppose, S face when I found it in the crowd had gone the color of old paper. And quote, for 30 years and quote, I continued, my voice carrying easily through the ballroom and oppose, S sound system and quote, my husband and I made a choice that some of you might consider strange. We built something significant and we chose to live small. Not because we were ashamed of what we and oppose D built, but because we understood something about wealth that I don and oppose T think enough people understand. It changes how people treat you long before it changes anything else about who you are. End quote. I let that sit for a moment. End quote. 10 months ago my husband died. 6 days after his funeral, my son handed me $200 and a list of nursing homes and told me I had until the end of the month to leave the house I raised him in. End quote. A ripple went through the room. Not quite gasps, but something close. End quote. In the months since, that same son filed a legal petition to have me declared incompetent. To seize control not just of my home, but, though I don and oppose, T believe he understood this at the time, of the trust that controls this company. Hired a private investigator to surveil me. Falsified reports at his own division to secure a promotion he believed would make him look successful enough to challenge me in court, though he had no idea, until this exact moment, exactly what he was challenging. End quote. I found Nathan and oppose, S eyes across the room. He hadn't and oppose T moved. I don and oppose, T think he could. End quote. I share this not to humiliate my son in front of his colleagues. End quote. I said, softening only slightly. End quote. Though I understand that may be an unavoidable result. I share it because every person in this room who works for a division head, a manager, a supervisor deserves to know exactly the character of the leadership making decisions above them. And because the board deserves to know that the regional director up for promotion this quarter is currently under formal internal review for falsifying performance data. A review that, as of this morning, I have asked our compliance department to formally escalate. End quote. Patricia Alvarez, standing near the podium, nodded once grimly. This part at least she had known was coming. End quote. As for the guardianship petition against me, end quote, I continued, end quote, it is scheduled for hearing this coming Monday. I expect it will not take long, given that it was built substantially on a fabricated pattern of confusion I have never exhibited, supported by an affidavit signed by my granddaughter under false information provided to her by her own father. End quote. I glanced toward Mia, who sat straight-backed and dry-eyed in the front row, having long since made her peace with the part she had to play. End quote. My granddaughter has since retracted that affidavit in writing, and has instead provided testimony regarding the circumstances under which it was obtained. End quote. I paused, looking out over the room one final time. End quote. I am not interested in revenge. End quote, I said. End quote. I have spent my whole life avoiding the kind of attention this moment is currently giving me, and I intend to go back to avoiding it the moment I step away from this podium. But I built this company with a man who believed that character revealed itself. Eventually, no matter how carefully someone tried to hide it. I would rather it reveal itself here, among people who deserve honesty from their leadership, than in a courtroom on Monday, in front of a judge who was about to be lied to. End quote. I stepped back from the podium. The silence in the room lasted for nearly 10 full seconds before Patricia Alvarez began, quietly, to clap, and the rest of the room, uncertainly at first and then all at once, followed. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs as several of the regional managers near Nathan shifted away from him, almost imperceptibly, the way people instinctively put a few inches of distance between themselves and someone who has just become a cautionary tale. One of the financial journalists in the back row was already typing rapidly, and I understood without needing to check, that whatever story ran in Tomorrow and Oppo's business section would not be a kind one. Patricia found me at the podium and Oppo's edge as the room began filing out for the recess, her hand extended, her expression somewhere between professional respect and genuine curiosity. End quote, 11 years, end quote, she said, end quote, and I had no idea whose approval I was working to earn, end quote. End quote, you earned it, end quote, I told her, shaking her hand. End quote, every quarter. I read every report you ever filed, Patricia, long before tonight. This company is exactly as strong as it is because of the job you and Oppos V done, not because of anything I did from a kitchen table 40 miles from here. End quote. End quote. Will you be at the next meeting? End quote. End quote. I Don and Oppos T no yet. End quote. I admitted. End quote. I think for now I and Oppos D like to go back to being the person in the front row nobody looks at twice. I and Oppos V found I do my best thinking there. End quote. I did not look for Nathan and Oppos S face in the crowd as the ballroom emptied. I already knew what I would find there, and I found I no longer needed to see it to know it was true. Monday and Oppos S guardianship hearing lasted 11 minutes. The Fairview County probate courtroom was smaller than I and Oppos D imagined, wood-paneled and half-empty. Nothing like the crowded ballroom 4 days earlier. Nathan sat beside his attorney at the petitioner and Oppos S table, still in the same gray suit he and Oppos D worn to the shareholder meeting as though he hadn't and Oppos T had the heart to put on a different one. He did not look at me when I walked in. Arthur squeezed my hand once before we took our seats. End quote. Case number 24-1187. In the matter of the guardianship of Margaret and Doyle. End quote. The clerk read. End quote. Petitioner Nathan Doyle. End quote. Judge Delgado, a tired-looking man in his 60s who had clearly presided over every version of this story before, looked first at the petition in front of him, then at Nathan, then for a long moment at me. End quote. Before we begin, end quote, he said, end quote, I understand there have been some developments since this petition was filed. Counsel? End quote. Nathan and Oppos S attorney rose slowly, a young man who suddenly looked like he wished he were anywhere else. End quote. Your Honor, in light of recent public information, and a formal retraction of the supporting affidavit filed by the petitioner and Oppos S daughter, my client wishes to withdraw the petition. End quote. The judge nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he and Oppos D already suspected walking in. He looked at the retraction Mia had filed, then at the 3 independent competency evaluations Arthur had submitted weeks earlier. Then, finally, he took off his glasses entirely. End quote. Mr. Doyle, end quote, he said, and his voice had gone flat, almost weary. End quote. I and Oppos V been on this bench 18 years. I and Oppos LL simply note for the record that this court takes a dim view of guardianship petitions filed for financial motive rather than genuine welfare concern, particularly ones supported by affidavits obtained under incomplete information from a family member. You and Oppos fortunate your mother ISN and Oppos T pursuing sanctions against you for the filing itself. I and Oppos D suggest you consider that a mercy, and I and Oppos D suggest you spend some time thinking about how you got here. End quote. Nathan still hadn't, and Oppos T looked at me. When he finally did, just once on his way out of the courtroom, I didn't, and Oppos T see anger in his face. I saw something closer to a boy who has just realized, too late, that the house he thought he was standing safely inside of had never had walls at all. I wasn't an Oppos T pursuing sanctions. Arthur had recommended it strongly. I had declined. End quote. I and Oppos V taken enough from him already. End quote. I told Arthur in the hallway outside the courtroom. End quote. Let the rest happen on its own. End quote. It did. Terminated Nathan and Oppos S employment 11 days after the shareholder meeting, citing the falsified performance reports, a decision made entirely by Patricia Alvarez and the compliance department, without a single word of input from me, though I imagine no one on that board doubted what I would have wanted. The internal investigation, once fully unwound, revealed enough discrepancies that the company and Oppos S outside auditors were brought in. Nathan avoided criminal charges only because the financial impact, while embarrassing, fell below the threshold that would have triggered a formal fraud referral. He was not so fortunate with the private investigator he and Oppos D hired, surveilling a private citizen without consent. It turned out, sat closer to the legal line than he and Oppos D assumed, and Arthur made certain the county prosecutor and Oppos S office received a full copy of Ruiz and Oppos S file. Nathan called me once the night he was terminated, his voice thick in a way I hadn't and Oppos T heard since he was a boy who and Oppos D broken something he couldn't and Oppos T fix. End quote. You could have stopped this, end quote, he said. End quote. One phone call. You could have told Patricia to let it go. End quote. End quote, I could have, end quote, I agreed. End quote, I didn't, end oppose. T falsify a single report, Nathan. I didn't, end oppose. T hire a man to photograph my own mother and oppose. S house. I didn't, end oppose. T sit my daughter in a kitchen and hand her a form I knew she wouldn't, and oppose. T read closely enough to understand what it truly did. Every single choice that led to tonight belonged to you. All I did was refuse to hide the consequences of it. End quote. End quote. You humiliated me in front of 400 people. End quote. End quote. You tried to have me declared unfit to manage my own life. End quote. I said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, I let my voice go hard. End quote. In a courtroom in front of a judge, using your own daughter and oppose. S trust as a weapon to do it. I didn't, and oppose. T humiliate you, Nathan. I simply stopped protecting you from what you and oppose. D already done. End quote. He didn't, and oppose. T have an answer for that. After a long silence, he hung up without saying goodbye, and it would be nearly a year before either of us spoke again. Christine left him within the month. I don and oppose. T know all the details. Mia has been careful, out of some lingering loyalty to her father, not to share everything. But I understand the email Ruiz uncovered eventually found its way, through channels I never asked Arthur to explain to me, into Christine and Oppo's own hands. Whatever conversation followed, it ended with her moving out of their apartment and, according to Ruth and Oppo's ever-reliable network of information, back in with her mother 2 towns over. Cedar Falls, being Cedar Falls, learned the whole story within a season. Nathan stopped attending the church where he and Oppo's once given his father and Oppo's eulogy. I heard secondhand that he took a job with a competitor 2 states away, a much smaller company that, as far as I know, has no idea who his mother is. I did not celebrate any of it. There is no version of watching your own son lose his career, his marriage, and his standing in his hometown that feels like winning, even when every part of it was earned by his own choices. I grieved it, in fact, the way I imagine Harold Bennett must have grieved his own sons, quietly on porches, in the small hours when no one else could see. But I did not regret it either. Some prices, once set in motion by the person who owes them, cannot be waived without becoming complicit in the debt. Mia moved in with me the following spring, not out of necessity since her internship had, by then, turned into a full-time compliance position at DES with a salary entirely her own, but because, as she put it, end quote, I like the porch better than my apartment, and you make better coffee than anyone I know, end quote. We didn't, end oppose. Talk about the company much in the day-to-day. I still garden. I still keep the crooked porch step Walter never fixed because fixing it now feels like erasing something. Once a quarter I attend the board meetings I and Oppos am entitled to attend, sit quietly near the back, and let Patricia Alvarez run the company the way she and Oppos run it for 11 years, brilliantly without my interference, exactly the way Walter and I always intended. I did reach out to Nathan once about 8 months after the shareholder meeting. Not to reconcile, I wasn't and Oppos ready for that, and I and Oppos am not certain I ever will be, but to send through Arthur a short handwritten note. Nathan, I loved you before I had anything to give you, and I loved you the same after. What happened this year wasn't an Oppos punishment. It was simply the truth catching up to choices you made on your own. The door ISN and Oppos locked. It and Oppos just not going to open itself. Mom. He hasn't an Oppos written back. Mia tells me he and Oppos doing better slowly in the new job, in a small apartment 2 states away that has nothing measured for a nursery in it. I hope someday there and Oppos a version of my son I can sit across a kitchen table from again, the way I used to when he was small enough to fall asleep against my shoulder. Until then I have Mia and Ruth next door, and a company that carries my late husband and Oppos name into 11 states without either of us ever needing our own names attached to it. Last autumn I did something I and Oppos wanted to do for years. I quietly funded a scholarship at the community college in Walter and Oppos name for kids from families like the one we used to be. No press release. No plaque with my name on it. Just an account set up through the trust that pays for textbooks and tuition for a dozen students a year who will likely never know where the money came from. I think Walter would have liked that better than anything with our names carved into it. People in Cedar Falls still think of me, mostly, As the quiet widow on Maple Street with the I spent 30 years choosing to be underestimated, and if I and Oppos V learned anything from this last difficult year it and Oppos that being underestimated was never a weakness. It was simply where I did my best work. 10 years is a long time and also nothing at all. Mia is 34 now, a compliance director at DES in her own right, with a laugh that still sounds exactly like it did when she was small enough to fall asleep on my porch swing. She married a quiet, patient man named Sam who fixes old motorcycles in the garage on weekends, and they have a boy, Walter, named at Mia and Oppos' insistence and very much against my modest objections, who is 7 years old and has his great-grandfather and Oppos' exact stubborn chin. It was young Walter who asked me the question over pie on a Sunday in October that felt very much like every other Sunday, except that it wasn't and Oppos' tea. End quote. Grandma Mia says you used to own a whole company and nobody knew, end quote. He said, feet swinging under the kitchen chair, entirely too young to understand what a strange sentence that was. End quote. Why didn't an Oppos' you just tell everybody? Wouldn't and Oppos' that have been easier? End quote. I thought about how to answer a 7-year-old honestly, which is often harder than answering anyone else honestly. End quote. Sometimes, end quote. I told him, end quote. The truth is more useful if you save it for exactly the right moment, instead of spending it the second you have it. Your great-uncle Nathan needed to believe he and Oppos' already won before I could show him he never had a chance. If I and Oppos' told him everything at the start, he might have stopped himself in time, and then I never would have known for certain exactly what he was capable of. End quote. Walter considered this with the enormous seriousness only a child can bring to a slice of pie. End quote. Did you forgive him? End quote. That was the harder question, and he knew it, the way children sometimes know exactly which question will make the grown-ups go quiet. End quote. I forgave him for being afraid, end quote, I said slowly. End quote. Afraid of not having enough, afraid of being ordinary, afraid of a mother who turned out to be more than he ever gave her credit for. I understand fear. I and Oppos' felt it myself. End quote. I set down my fork. End quote. I haven and Oppos' forgiven him for what he did with it. Those are different things, and I Don and Oppos' think you have to do both to have peace. End quote. Nathan and I speak twice a year now. His birthday and a stiff, careful phone call around the holidays that Mia insists on arranging, standing just close enough to referee if it goes wrong, which it hasn't, and Oppos' not in 3 years. He lives 2 states away still, remarried to a woman named Diane who runs a small accounting firm and who, from what I understand, keeps him more honest than he and Oppos' ever managed on his own. He sent a card last Christmas with an actual handwritten sentence in it, longer than anything he and Oppos' written me in a decade. I think about that note you sent for a long time before I understood what it meant. I and Oppos' am sorry it took me this long. I hope the door and Oppos' still there. I wrote back one line, it never moved. We are not close. I Don and Oppos' know that we ever will be again. Not the way we were before the funeral, before the envelope, before I understood exactly what my own son believed I was worth. But some doors Don and Oppos' need to be thrown open to matter. Sometimes it and Oppos' enough that they and Oppos' simply not locked. Doyle Industrial Supply is larger now than it was the year of the shareholder meeting. Patricia Alvarez retired 2 years ago, handing the company to a capable young CEO who has never once needed to know my name, exactly as Walter and I always intended. The scholarship fund at the community college has put 41 students through school since I started it, and every spring I get a small stack of thank you notes from strangers who have no idea they and Oppos' rewriting to the majority shareholder of the company most of their parents worked for. I still garden. I still have the crooked porch step. Ruth still comes on Tuesdays, though these days it and Oppos' mostly for coffee and gossip rather than cleaning, since I finally hired someone younger to handle the parts of the house that have gotten harder for both of us to manage. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I sit on that porch and think about the woman I used to be, the one who counted $200 in front of her own son and said nothing, who kept a notebook of dates and injuries in her apron pocket, who let an entire family believe she was slipping away simply because it was the only way to find out, for certain, who among them actually loved her, and who was only ever waiting for an inheritance. I Don and Oppos' regret the waiting. I don and oppose. T regret the silence or the patience, or the year it took to let the truth arrive exactly when it needed to. I only regret some nights that it had to be my own son who taught me how necessary all of it was. But Walter always said character reveals itself eventually, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. Mine, it turns out, was never really hidden at all. It was only ever waiting to be needed.